So I come out of a tradition that has a very different approach to politics than the Platypus. When we launched our magazine in 1986, we were deliberately making a connection between the younger generation, at the time I was the younger generation, of radicals, and people who had joined the movement in the World War I era, who had been part of the continuation of an Anarcho-Syndicalist movement rooted in ethnic communities and working class communities, such forth. And while I would not want to say that the tradition has all the answers, that's clearly not true because capitalism is still with us. Nonetheless, I believe that the tradition has a great deal to offer, and that many of the efforts to rethink the traditional ideas of the radical left, whether anarchist or socialist, have in fact been steps backward. Things that you can find, for example, in the early Ukrainian before he became a revolutionary, or in the pre-Marxian socialists. We see a great deal of backward-looking development in the guise of adjustment to new realities. And I feel just of our vision under that same flow. So, we published our magazine. We launched it because we felt there was a need, on the one hand, for more theoretical reflection. Most of the publications coming out of our review were more activist oriented. And on the other hand, there wasn't a need in particular to grapple with some of the challenges of economics and how a self-managed economic theory is impacted by the fundamental changes in the economy since the time much of the work a century ago was done in formulating our basic economic precepts. I don't think these changes undermine the fundamental analysis in any way, but they certainly bring very different tools and challenges and such. The fundamental goal of Anarcho-Syndicalism has always been to bring an end to the exploited, oppressive conditions under which the present exploiters live, and instead to bring about a society founded on democratic principles, a society where people rule, that is, democracy, true democracy. Democracy is a much abused term. Brutal dictatorships proclaim themselves democratic people's republics. Pro-capitalist politicians proclaim themselves democrats. Union busters and exploiters of child labor characterize their crusade to strip workers of their last vestigial workplace rights as an effort to restore freedom and democracy. You can read such latter current issue of the University City Review, my doorstep yesterday. Everyone seems is for democracy, but too many wish to confine it to the narrowest occasions, a brief moment of voting, choosing between predetermined options that represent at best different factions among those who rule us. Real democracy is a process, an activity, through which people have unfettered access to information pertaining to all aspects of our lives. Free discussion, in which all viewpoints have an equal right to be heard. A dialogic process in which we evaluate the options together. Deliberate and agree upon a course of action that best serves our needs. And of course, the organized power to carry out our decisions. Otherwise, the debating society requires to change the world. And democracy is the process of changing the world in the interest of ourselves, the majority. I should be clear that this is not a unitary process. Democracy needs to suffuse all aspects of society. Decisions should be considered and taken by those who may most directly affect. Some decisions will be taken at the workplace level, others in the neighborhood, still others in the self-organized groups who will create to meet our full range of needs and desires. And some decisions I'll just make myself, like what kind of tea I'm going to have in my life. It's not going to be subjected to any broader social debate. Where decisions implicate the rights of others, there will need to be coordination and mutual agreement. Our commitments to decentralization and federalism are not supplements, they are fundamental to the realization of genuine democracy. If if we have to make all decisions on a worldwide basis, then it becomes impossible to have true democratic discussion. And there is no need to do that. It's inefficient. We would spend our entire lives in meetings that would just be hell. Bad happens. Most of those who discuss democracy would confine it to only a portion of our lives. Some in the process of selecting representatives who rule in our name, claim to represent our interests with some variant of Rousseau's universal will. Some might allow full participation in the political process, perhaps permitting us to criticize our rulers or march in the streets when our rights are violated. But we deny the access to information and the right to communicate that are so essential to democratic discourse. These Democrats, having reduced democracy to the nearest facade, see no contradiction in subjecting us to the most brutal dictatorship in our economic lives, in our work, our relations with landlords and banks, our access to the necessities of life. Such a conception of democracy is not only impoverished, it is one that leaves its subjects. And there can be no mistaking the fact that those who are reduced to the status of certain in their economic lives are subjects, in practice excluded from meaningful participation in democracy in any sphere of our existence, leaving its subjects as powerless in the political domain as in every other. To speak of genuine democracy is necessarily to propose a vision of an ultimate society. This includes work-based councils and socialized industries, popular assemblies and neighborhoods, and a host of self-managed voluntary associations to deal with our various interests and needs. Everyone participates, or at least has the possibility, the option, the invitation to participate. Decisions are made through face-to-face direct democracy. Councils and assemblies are associated through networks and federations. But there must be decisions. Collective decisions have to be made, and if not by democratic procedures through discussion, then how? People's participation in decision-making is an essential part of their freedom. And the only way that we can ensure that the needs and interests of everyone are taken into account, that we find solutions that maximize our freedom, our potential, our agreement. Collective decision-making by free and equal people is the essence of democracy. Democratic life then is the striving of people to mobilize and organize ourselves to satisfy our needs and desires, to live our lives as we want. But such self-activity inevitably clashes with the democratic state. Really a form of oligarchic government, the state uses representative democratic forms to co-opt and compress the population into passivity and acceptance of its rule. The conflict then is not only between governors and government, but also between exploiters and exploited. It is not enough to attack society's political decision-making methods. It is also necessary to end the wage system of the market and private property production. It is necessary to expropriate the capitalist and abolish capitalism, along with all supporting forms of oppression, racism, patriarchy, imperialism, the list would go on, as well as abolishing the state. The state, either the existing one or some potential state that could be created, is not, on the one hand, a real process in practice. It is an abstraction based on coercion, based on force. And it cannot be used for the sort of fundamental change that we envision. A new society must be prefigured by a movement of the working class and all oppressed peoples, a movement which is as radically democratic as possible.
Thanks. Hi there. Do you hear me? Yeah. Good, okay. So I guess, well, I'm going to be pretty underwhelming, right, because I don't have answers to most of the questions. But the reason that I don't have answers to most of the questions, and maybe what I am going to talk about can help to make clear why I don't have. Not that they're not good questions, they're good and important questions. I guess the place to start is positive. Well, one of them is that there is no left in the U.S. at this point. Right? Insofar as what it means to have a left is to have like an organic and rooted social and political movement that's capable of influencing its own political behavior. Right? Not seizing power, but is capable of influencing its own political behavior. 2016 showed us, but it didn't have to. We knew already anyway, paying attention, that between 6.5 and 9 million people who voted for Obama at least once, and Sanders voted for Trump. Right? And what that says is yes, Hillary Clinton was the dominant candidate, right? There's no question about that. But that way the Democratic Party hasn't had anything to offer people, massive people who work for a living in the U.S. And into that broad category, I would include what's stereotypically considered the working class, which is the industrial working class, or what the pollsters call working class, non-college educated males or white males. But it's still basically the image of the working classes concocted in the Cold War. Beefy white guy with a hard hat and the flat flannel shirt. Now it's also include nursing or whatever. But when you consider, I would guess, and it's not only guess, but it's sort of educated guess, that 30 to 40%, and I think that's probably a conservative estimate, of people who are considered middle class are basically working class people who have a mortgage or think they can afford it. Right? The economist Michael Zweig, a number of years ago, did a really interesting book called Working Class Majority America's Best Kept Secret. And what he found was that, while opinion polls characteristically report that most people identify it as belonging to this amorphous middle class. What Zweig found was that when a working class component is added to the options, about 55 to 65% of respondents identify as working class, and that sort of matches up with his empirical breakdown of the labor force, and that roughly matches, or that percentage roughly matches up with the percentage of working people who exercise minimal supervisory authority on their jobs. So, okay, why am I going on? Because I think another lesson to take from 2016 is that given the way that that neoliberal leftism has evolved, or the left-wing neoliberal since Clinton, we've moved farther and farther away from an understanding of the states of politics, the states of political action that's rooted in class and political economy, and increasingly to one that's rooted in disparities recognized according to ascriptive characteristics, right? So just this morning, for instance, I saw an editorial in Forbes that proclaimed that reparations, the pursuit of reparations for Black Americans, is the way forward to make the society pure, clean, I guess. All right. That's clearly been a dominant trend in the left wing of the Democratic Party since ironically, Clinton. In Clinton's first one, he actually played in the opposite direction, but certainly since Obama, right? That's been a dominant trend in the Democratic Party, and we see how it played out in 2016. Right? So a couple of points to make about this before I get to the crescendo, I guess, one, we tend to look for quick fixes or magical solutions, like what I sometimes call the myth of the spark. Right? Some cataclysmic event is going to knock the shackles off of people's eyes and they see clearly, and the movement will emerge. And that's what the Obama phenomenon was all about. Because we look closely at Obama, and granted, I had the advantage of having been in the birthing room of the outset of his political career, basically. In 1995, in the state Senate district, he ran from. But Obama was never anything other than an ordinary Clintonite neoliberal Democrat, right? But the way that the racial narrative worked, and his call for us to see him as the embodiment of all of our hopes and aspirations. Oh, I don't want to say snookered, but for want of a better word off the top of my head, snookered a lot of the people who, good and decent people, but it also kind of played to the dreams of a lot of people who frankly thought to have known better, people who were more politically sophisticated. And once he's elected, then the charge for us all is to defend him, right? And it's understandable that people would see that as a charge because of the way he was being attacked. But the same thing happened with his re-election. So after 2 terms of Obama, though, we came to a point at which the understanding, right, of what progress means in American politics narrowed increasingly around the pursuit of first women, first black, first Latino, first gay, first lesbian, first transgender. All within a framework that within the economies of neoliberalism. Bernie Sanders, and I'll be honest, I'm partisan, I worked in campaigns in 2016, probably will this time. But Bernie Sanders posed a challenge to the neoliberal left, basically, in the U.S. It was kind of a call to get back to political economy and focus on inequality. And after, and in Obama's second term, and backtrack for a second, Occupy phenomenon, which followed on the heels of the so-called Arab Spring, gave the impression that there was a popular groundswell of progressive activism among young people in particular. And I had a back-to-back Thursday after Thursday lunch with two of my colleagues in history, actually, where we were old friends, where we talked about this, and in response, and they both commonly made statements then that Occupy's impact was that it had people talking about inequality. And my question was in both cases, well, who that wasn't talking about inequality before is talking about it now? I mean, I know you and your friends were, I and my friends were. And the answer in both cases was the New York Times, right? And the response to that is, well, yeah, well, 4 months ago, the New York Times was talking about Kim Kardashian's marriage and the divorce of basketball. All right, so then why am I mentioning that? Because I think that the Occupy experience gave us a foretaste of a more recent phenomenon of the massive explosion in membership of democratic socialists in America. And now we're hearing the same kind of thing about socialism no longer being a dirty word. And that is also taken as an expression of progress. But I think a problem with that, and all humanity, right? 20 plus years ago, I, through a fortuitous set of circumstances, made a presentation to a Chabot Community College anthropology class about the idea of a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would guarantee every resident right to a job and a living wage. And yeah, I mean, some of the students were incensed by it. And one woman said, her mother was a small business and she had to pay people $10 an hour in 1995 or $6. She wouldn't be able to realize her dream. But another guy said to me, well, I can appreciate this thing you're talking about, but it feels to me that you're being disingenuous because you're not following socialism. And he said, if you were just to call it socialism, I might even support it. And I said, well, at this point, what socialism means is very much functioning left as quickly as possible, given what we're up against. But you can't wait a line and make it happen. And we aren't going to convince people to sign on to abstract commitment to abstract socialism. In fact, DSA can't even agree on what socialism is supposed to entail at this point. So what all this comes down to is that the imperative need, and this is granted like it's old school, and it really doesn't have anything to say about the bigger theoretical questions. Well, to this point, I'm more than happy to leave to others. But it seems to me that the most reasonable path for us for trying to build the left, and it's not going to be something that happens by 2020 or 2024, but to build like an institutionally rooted left is to try to mobilize around and build support around campaigns for what are sometimes called practical utopian agendas, right? Like Medicare for all, free, and that's the kind of approach I think that will get us out through the labor movement, because among other reasons, like the trade union movement is not only vital for material resources, but trade union members are people who have connections out among those 6.5 to 9 million people who should have been ours, right? I mean, not one of them, but who voted for Trump, and I believe that case of mistaken identity. And this is the thing, this is the kind of approach that people who understand themselves to be on the left for at least the last 30 years have been avoiding, right? And arguments are like, we don't have time to do that. The fascists banging at the door and talk fascists. But the reality is that we're in this position because we don't have that kind of movement. And the number one task is to figure out how to try to build it. And I'll conclude with this one reflection that for most of us, right, for the working people of all sorts, and I'll be happy to talk about the identity politics stuff too, but you can later. Most of us got more from Richard Nixon's presidency than we've gotten from any of the 3 Democratic presidents. And it's certainly not because Nixon liked us more. I mean, he hated us, right? No question. But the difference, and I know Clinton liked us, and Obama liked us, and Carter liked us, and it's weird that this way. But the difference was the social forces that our movements are associated with were stronger than, right? They had enough social power that Nixon had to respond to them, and does of course stuff like OSHA, the EPA, affirmative action, you guys say. So I'm now in the day. Thank you.
Thank you. So my comments will be somewhat more general, non-American historian, American political scientist, and a historian of thought, first and foremost. And I've done a lot of work on Marx and the Marxist tradition as well as post-Marxism. I have to admit I have also not answered the question, so I think that somehow that kind of rolled into some of the things that I want to say. But I will say that the first thing that I want to say is express some distance from both mature working class and mature left. Like Adolph, I would say there is no left in America. And I am not sure that that's a bad thing in certain ways, in that, of course, we do have a history, almost a 2-century-long history, of the attempt to create a homogeneous. And that's people like you, John, on the margins of that movement, the anarchists, in a sense, excluded already in the First International. And so when I think about that, I think about at most a kind of plurality of sometimes cooperative, sometimes contestatory movements, that if they find common ground, they find common ground not in some sort of ontological source of unity, but rather through a kind of process of argumentation, or to use the language, for instance, the political theorist Chantal movement in thought, through an articulation of equivalence, where you, in a sense, are able to link struggles to each other and find those kinds of common ground. So, the first thing I would say is that when we talk about that, I think we have to be very guarded, because in fact we have a history of the attempt to construct that unified left. It's never been very successful. That's an understatement in the American context. More globally, I think it's created as many problems as it's solved. And so I find myself at most kind of arguing for kind of proliferation or plurality of movements, again, which have to, in a sense, articulate commonalities and sources of common interest, as well as possibilities of common action. As far as the working class, the old mantra from Karl Marx, social being precedes social consciousness. So that somehow you can ascribe a working class identity, and in some ways even the proper consciousness, based on the person's placement within the social order. That again is something that I find myself very skeptical of. It is a way of essentially robbing people of their own agency and the capacity to articulate their interests. It also, in some ways, I think, blindsides us to some of the real problems that we face when people seem to vote against their interests. And it's the cheapest way out to simply say they're voting against their interests, because in fact their interests are not being handed to them through their position in a social order, I would argue. Or again, we have to argue. We have to articulate that set of interests. I wanted to say something briefly about utopia. In the questions that we were given, we were presented with a series of right-wing populist movements. And of course, we face a moment in global history, especially Western European and North American history, when I would argue a crucial dimension of democracy rises up and confronts us in its pathological form. Namely, I think we would be making a mistake if we did a kind of populist moment in democracy is by definition anti-democratic. I would argue that some kind of populist dimension belongs to what democracy is. And it's only because, in a sense, liberal. Now, it's only because liberal democracy succeeded in monopolizing the definition of democracy that we're now confronted with populism as if it's somehow the opposite of democracy. So we've got a pathological form that we have to confront, but we also have to confront it not by simply insisting on that thinnest definition of democracy, but in a sense by articulating a critique of elites and oligarchies of the various ways in which democracy has been captured and monopolized and distorted by elites. What those right-wing populist movements of the present day really lack is a conception of utopia. And you don't have to study very deeply into the 20th century political history to see that the early right-wing movements of the 20th century were utopian movements. Now, those are, again, in my opinion, pathological utopias. The utopia of a pure people, of a racially pure people, is a pathology, but it's a utopia. It is a politics which is grounded in a future-oriented historicity. Now, if the right-wing populism for the present moment are absent utopia. Of course, part of the problem with the, let's call it the left-wing response to this is that the left is also grounded in an extremely presentist sense of history. Utopia has lost its hold. So we're in a sense in a situation where both left and right are kind of flattened out into this kind of presentist perspective, and no real conception of the future really holds our attention, kind of captivates us, and is suitable to motivate us towards action. And one response to this, and I think that it's been a very powerful response on the left. Again, I'm using these, I think we're forced to use these kind of categories, I would still remind you that I don't believe that there's a left in any self-evident sense. But, of course, one response, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been melancholy. Kind of, to take that, the literal, or, the Freudian definition of melancholy, it's a form of grieving that never can, in a sense, overcome the experience of loss. Work through towards some different way of accommodating the lost object. And in some ways, I think that we still remain in a melancholic framework. I was in Hartland the other day. I was happened to be driving through my local radio, and I was listening to On Me, and I caught a bit of an interview with, I guess, the Danish thinker, Robert Breckman, and led me to a brief foray of 15 minutes after a brief dig into the book, which I definitely want to read, which is titled Utopia for Realists, How We Can Build the Ideal World. And he too shares this basic diagnosis of the present, which is that it is too presentist, that our time horizon has become flattened, and that the real crisis that we face is our inability to generate other visions. So he makes a distinction that I think is worth sharing with you. I don't think it's a decision that others have made that I made in my book, Post-Marxism, but he talks about utopia as a blueprint, and utopia as a kind of vague outline. And of course, a blueprint is exactly the kind of utopianism that I think we should avoid. That again would be creating monolithic impositions, imputed unities and harmonies that I think can only lead to a certain kind of violence or simply paralyzing defeatism. Vague outline sounds a little more promising. And I think that partially it's because it's less directed, it's less commanding, it doesn't force us into a situation either of trying to invent the future whole law or trying to impose that invention on historical reality, which is always going to be more complex than any human crimes. Something that Breckman articulates, which I also found is, can you actually hear me? Like, do I need to talk to this for purposes of recording? Can I just hear you? Okay, that's better. Let's just, okay, good. We'll rely on the human mind. Okay, so, Breckman also speaks about his own generation, so he's a 27-year-old. And he points to something that I think is really, really important, which is he is a post-war creature. And I think, even myself, I happened to be living in Berlin at the time we fell over the wall, so I danced on the wall, I struck my hammer against it. I actually probably have real chips in the Berlin wall. Unlike probably religious relics that circulate around the world. But it was pretty hard in the Cold War period to escape the kind of binaries of a geopolitical polarized world where communism and capitalism seemed like, in a sense, the two ends, the kind of the two end destinations of slippery slopes in both directions. And we are in a situation where we don't have to be imprisoned by those kinds of logics. Socialism doesn't need to kind of bear a large test. It can be also linked up with pragmatic solutions thoroughly and finally, the deep-rooted tendency which precedes Lenin, but certainly gets its classic articulation in Lenin, which is that theory is the vanguard of action. Action is innovation, and action is creativity. It doesn't mean that we become purely spontaneous, just leaping into any breach and then thinking about what we've done afterwards. But I think that theorists, for instance, have really stepped back from political movements and that these political movements are kind of discover their own creativity. At most, then, the intellectuals, the theorists can kind of come in and try to figure out how movements connect with each other. And try to, again, kind of articulate those connections between different expressions of political contestation. Another part of how I would read this big outline idea of utopian, again, I only have 15 minutes to read this book, would be to go back to something that I found very powerful in the way that David Graeber talked about the Occupy movement, and that is the idea of the prefigurative politics. The idea that one acts as if one is already free, that one prefigures the political community that one hopes to achieve. So that freedom is not a goal out there in some possibly receding future, but rather is something that we can actually enact and act on. But what that suggests is that insofar as, like, for instance, this panel is posing this question of democracy on the left, we have to hold on to the idea that the various forms of resistance, the various forms of democratic activism, don't necessarily add up. They produce islands and pockets that, again, can be articulated together, can be discovered to have equivalencies, but are not first and foremost adding up to a singular movement. Now we're going to make one final point here. I think I'm not enough of an anarchist to go fully down your sketching. And that is, I would say, democracy is not one single thing. Now, liberal democracy, as I've said earlier, is the absolute thinnest construction of democracy. It's largely an ideological cover. And one has to recognize that as such. I think about, for instance, your question about Brexit. So, of course, there's a long history, especially among British Eurosceptics, criticism of what is called the democratic deficit in the European Union. But the assumption there is that somehow their own national democracies are not suffering deficit. The problem with liberal democracy is that it is a democratic deficit. But that doesn't mean that representative democracy is an illegitimate form. Okay, so I would say, in this sense, I cannot imagine a modern society that doesn't have a state of some sort. And I think that some kind of organization of our collective lives and our interests and our pursuits calls for a form of representation. But the problem would be, A, to allow that liberal democratic ideological construction to capture the definition of representative democracy. And then B, and here, John, I would 100% agree with you, B, we have to recognize that democracy is also forms of direct democracy. And I think that even if the relationship between a robust, and maybe this is not more a term for you, but a robust conception of representation can sit beside forms of direct democracy, and that we can have these two things working together, hopefully enriching the ways in which we make decisions at various levels of our society.
Okay, can you hear me? In my remarks, I will explain the unique approach Marx and Marxism took towards democracy and how it differs from conventional analyses of democracy today. A formative experience for Marx, and perhaps a moment of origin for Marxism, was the failure of the 1848 revolution in France and throughout Europe, referred to in textbooks as the spring of the nations. 1848 will be our guide to the Marxist approach to the democratic revolution. As we will see, democracy is not an end in itself for Marx, nor is democracy a stable virtue that can be corrupted by inefficient or unjust governance. No, for Marx, democracy is a means by which society has revolutionized and continues to revolutionize itself. And furthermore, the character of the democratic revolution is subject to historical changes, namely, the changed historical circumstances of the Industrial Revolution, capitalism. The democratic revolution clearly predates 1848. We can name the Dutch revolts, the English Revolution, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution of 1789 among its ranks. So what is special about 1848? The above-named democratic revolutions all use democratic demands to rule the people in the French Revolution called the Third Estate to supplant the rule of feudal monarchy. The extent to which they failed to meet their aims, it was tragic. For example, the tragedy of the power of slavery in the Southern colonies following the American Revolution that would not be recognized until the American Civil War was nevertheless a phase in a trend of general progress of freedom and democracy. Not only was the 1848 revolution a failure, but the nature of that failure was different from the democratic revolutions prior. The bourgeoisie leading the democratic revolution did not tragically face defeat at the hands of repressive feudal interests. Rather, the bourgeois leaders of the democratic revolution were themselves forced to abandon their principles. As Engels put it, the bourgeoisie could no longer lead, and the proletariat was not yet ready. Some historical background is required to illuminate this point. The Revolution of 1848 was carried out against the regime of the July monarchy in France under Louis Philippe. Marx argues that the July monarchy was a bourgeois monarchy, but had been able to represent only a narrow scope of bourgeois interests. In the course of the 1848 revolution, the monarchy was supplanted by a bourgeois republic, which was able to represent the full scope of bourgeois interests, and which ruled in the name of the people. In order, however, to rule in the name of the people, the for example, national workshops to deal with this massive crisis, which had formerly supported the republic, responded to the democratic society from the aristocracy and 15,000 more. There is a bourgeois discontent of political struggles. It's a mistake that democracy and freedom on Trotsky was a problem thus. Can be achieved either by gathering itself and preparing to spring, or by a nation in the process of struggle becoming conclusively divided in order to free the best part of itself for the execution of those tasks which the nation as a whole is unable to carry out. These are two opposite sets of historical conditions, which in their pure form are, of course, possible only in composition. A middle course, as in source of all, the middle course that create. Anything with the revolution, exclusively the interests of the people, into those represented by bourgeoisie in the struggle for the democratic, and those represented by the proletariat in the struggle for socialism. Both have risen to the same democratic demand, and yet both were not seeing that demand through together. The general interest of society had itself society revolution to be able to lead the it was faced by the 48 revolution apart. It was forced by from the old bourgeois society in the neighborhood society. As Marx wrote, all fanatics for order are shot down on their balconies by mobs of drunken soldiers. Their domestic sanctions revolutionaries proclaimed their houses bombarded for amusement in the name of property, of family, of religion, and of order. Finally, the scum of bourgeois society forms the holy phalanx of order, and the hero Krapolinski, I'm referring to Louis Bonaparte at that moment, installs himself in the Tuileries as the savior of society crisis. Of course, Marx agrees with the anarchists that the goal of socialism would be eventually to abolish democracy. Democracy is, after all, a form of the state, as Engels put it, also in state revolution, and is therefore free. Marxists and anarchists disagree on the method of attaining this end. For Marxists, it can only be accomplished in and through radical democratic revolution in the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This, which Marx described in the letters of his friend Wedemeyer was as his only original theoretical contribution, was the lesson Marx drew from 1848 and the coup of Louis Bonaparte. The Marxist theory of socialism that developed in the following half-century was a response to the failure of the 1848 revolution. If the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat is the conclusion drawn from the inability of the bourgeoisie to lead, then the party is the remedy for the failure of the proletariat to lead. For Marx, this is the continued impasse of society with capitalism. The general character of the democratic revolution is both partisan and capitalist. Democratic discontents revolutionize society and remove capital through force, oppression, and demagogy. Not because these are inherent characteristics of democracy, not because the wrong, moral, and democratic people are governed, not because we don't have enough democracy, but because the ability of democracy to represent the general interests of society is in crisis. Once, democracy served as a means of revolutionizing society so that the general will could emerge from under the feudal yoke. The third state, people who work, were nothing in an ancient regime, and through the bourgeois democratic revolution, they were to become everything. Today, in the continued crisis of the Industrial Revolution, which points beyond our relation to labor that currently constitutes society as such, the democratic revolution can only be removed through strong socialism. This crisis of democracy, simply put, cannot be solved with increased democracy, which, as in 1848, will only serve to deepen and intensify that crisis of democracy. Only socialism, unsubordinated to bourgeois democratic demands, is able to see that crisis through. Already in 1848, the struggle for socialism was necessary to strive for the most basic democratic demands. As Marx wrote in 1848, Bonaparte, every demand of the simplest bourgeois financial reform, of the most ordinary liberalism, of the most formal republicanism, of the most insipid democracy, is simultaneously castigated as an attempt on society and stigmatized as socialism. The demand merely for democracy was only enough to democratically elect Louis Bonaparte in the name of saving society from what was stigmatized as socialism, namely the most ordinary liberalism, the most insipid democracy. Today, the left cries for democracy and social justice, the call of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, and calls itself variously democratic, Marxist, anarchist, post-Marxist, etc. Still, these democratic revolutions, from Occupy to Arab Spring to the #resistance, and to demagogy, the left emerges confused. Did the right foil us yet again? Are the people too racist and sexist? Were we not democratic enough? The Marxists of the Second International and the revolution of the early 20th century thought that they were not doing something completely new, but rather returning to the problems outlined by Marx in 1848. Perhaps we today are not so beyond the questions of Marxism as we might think.
So now we'll take a few minutes for the panelists to have the opportunity to respond to one another's presentations before opening it to Q&A from the audience. You want to just go to the Q&A?
I think I would say if we did that, I'm not going to take questions.
Yeah, we can shut up the discussion.
Okay,
I'll go a little bit deeper.
let's just go to the Q&A and then you can encapsulate whatever you have. So everyone is welcome to ask something. So we'll pass
We
this.
can turn that off.
And for me, I have 3 points. Okay. 2 of them interrelated. And what can I say? The 2 that are interrelated have to do with, on the one hand, institutions of the left or the working class or movements, and on the other, reforming visions. And it seems to me, and in my work, I have never worked, I write about the history of the labor press, and that's rooted in labor societies, the unions, the working class communities, and those institutions are really important. They own facilities where people can meet, they ran the dating societies, they had choirs, they sustained resistance cultures. In the face of oppression, you could retreat to mutual aid society and, cultural expressions inside. You could sustain the behavior because it was not dependent on capitalist relations. It circulated within a dedicated community. You could draw upon resources of the movement for mutual aid to help sustain activists who are blacklisted, both within institutional jobs in some cases, but also through collections and such. And so on the one hand, we're going, and they have to come organically out of our struggles. It can't be that I just sit here and say, we should build institutions. But building institutions is vital. And it's vital not only because it gives us strength and resources, but it also develops our capacity to struggle, to be democratic, to make decisions and administer our lives, and really come to a realization of what we really can do if we set our minds to it. And so institutions, I think, are central. The questions of character of those institutions, how we hold accountable, how we combat the inevitable trend towards bureaucratization and ossification. And we have to struggle against that always. And utopia, I think, is fundamentally related to that. We have to remember the sort of society that we have to find, we have to think about, we have to debate. We will not all agree. And I don't think we have to all agree. And those utopian struggles can take the form. I've had other work in years of shorter hours. I see no reason why we should still be working 10 and 12 hours a day when we had mass movements in the 80s for the 8-hour day. I see no reason why we should be working 6 hours a day trying to increase productivity. It's insane. And we can use that time to actually do things, to live lives that are the sort of lives that we would like to live. And to debate issues, and to think about vision, and to do democratic work. I have a review of Breckman's book on this issue. It's a very interesting book. I don't agree with everything, but the notion of thinking of struggles on the one hand take us where we would like to go. So for me, shorter hours, but a wage. Frankly, something about the environment. It would be nice if my children was my child could grow up to be able to breathe the air, not have to flee to the mountains. These are on the one hand practical, on the other hand utopian under existing conditions, and essential. They're necessary struggles, and even if we don't like them. Fighting for them, like you said, Nixon forces us, forces the establishment. Sorry. And then, I do think we need to keep in mind, Carter, for example, who is the most admirable ex-president of my lifetime. He actually goes out and tries to do productive things in society, unlike every other ex-president. And as president, he ran on a program of abolishing Taft-Hartley and empowering labor, and not a damn thing was done for any of those things. You both have to down 5%. So I can't get excited on platforms. I'm interested in what people do and moving people into struggle. And I'm not interested in revolutionary alchemy. This notion that we can accomplish a free society through establishing dictatorship, through a vanguard party, through top-down centralized rule. This is alchemy. It's not science. It's not social movements. It's not building our capacity to be free.
Right. Well, and I was thinking, I was waiting for the insult, but,
That was it.
yeah. And I would agree with that. And first off, I don't believe that a revolution is possible. And second, I don't know that the model is desirable. Even if one thought it might be possible. But just to amplify your point about those like institutions like mutual aid societies, I mean, it's highly indicative of the way labor historians, informed by Marxist theory for many, many decades, wrote about the rank and file, and the very language of the rank and file, kind of passive and mass. And labor history could be written as like essentially a series of theoretical statements that would then just kind of emanate down into this passive, receptive thing called rank and file. And like in my field, in historiography, it's been a kind of revolution within historiography, say, going back to about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to discover the robustness of, for instance, those 19th century so-called rank and file movements, where in fact a lot of the inventiveness was actually happening, and where people were living a life, again, like to kind of invoke David Graeber's idea, prefiguratively as if they were already free. And that again is a very different conception than the conception of kind of apocalyptic revolution. This is a kind of gradual transformation. Marx also using it as like the mold of history. And I think that Marx also, in some of his best moments, recognized the complexity of what social and historical transformation need. And it's indicative of the distance traveled in Marx that indicate, like in obscure texts like his initial critique of Hegel's philosophy, right in 1943. He's a champion of what he calls true democracy. And what that true democracy is a kind of uncontained, unpredictable, democratic power, which is not simply like kind of the demiurgic power of a unified people, but of people acting in all sorts of different ways. And the state is part of that equation for him. But that conception of true democracy is always in excess of it, it's institutional, but it's always in excess of institutions. And I do think that Marx in some ways succumbs to a flattered conception of social reality when he embraces a more robust conception of revolution. And I would also say that voting for Louis Napoleon, the plebiscite that authorized his status as an emperor, I kind of feel like it would be wrong to say that there was a bourgeois democracy that then in a sense handed over its power. It was a state of total crisis and total instability. So that I don't think that it would. I would find it insupportable to think that bourgeois democracy, telos, is Louis Napoleon, because liberal democracy did not establish itself in 1848. I think that there was an effort to do that, and suppressing the national workshops was part of that. But I don't think that we had anything like a liberal democracy, which then succumbs to the plebiscitary particularly. Although I would say, of all Marx's writing, I kind of feel like in the age of Trump, the 18th era is probably the most relevant.
I want to start out points of great, which are number one among them is the point about the collapse of the utopian ideals, and that's a huge problem, right? And I also agree that the distinction made between the blueprint and the outcome. And I think that kind of goes something like that. We'll refer to these programs as a practice in some ways. But Franklin Russell Jacobi did a book about 20 years ago, exactly, called Last Utopias. But he makes this argument that what had happened was in the absence of a radical left, what passes for the left becomes liberal and takes its cues from liberals, and the liberalism loses its own ideals. And we've seen this, ironically, with young people over the last 20 years, and I think that a lot of this has to do with the medialization of the actual political movements, right? A retreat from not only theory, but from consideration of political agendas that, in principle, would take longer than a couple of election cycles to realize. Even though the ostensibly pragmatic actionist line that they embrace wouldn't be realized in a couple of election cycles anyway, but this aim for transformative vision, right? And that's been coincident with the emergence of a strata of technicians as an activist, and especially in the time you see moving from congressional staff to public interest groups to trade union staff. So that's a definite problem, and that's a problem across the board, kind of a recession of political vision. I guess one thing I want to say about the working class notion is that, yeah, I agree with you. I don't see the working class as a given entity, but what I do see is like why people who work for it and don't necessarily have a singular or single consciousness. But the point is insofar as activists or the labor movement can be something like a school for the working people, like a political school, then it's a place that sort of strives to accentuate the best tendencies politically and to try to bevel away at the worst, basically. And that's another reason that I think the deep dive in the movement is what's been missing in all of our discussion. I guess that's about it for me, I think.
Okay, well, I guess I have a couple of things to respond to. And I'm actually going to start with what you mentioned before, because I would agree that Marx doesn't think that the two modes of democracy as democracies necessarily mythical. I think actually that's his argument. So, for example, if you ask Marx, well, why do you seem to adopt this more robust version of revolution as opposed to this idea you had in your earlier writings about democracy, I think you could say that it's actually a historical change. That what has happened is not that democracy itself necessarily comes to some sort of death country, like Napoleon. I don't think he said it at all. I think he said, well, perhaps we don't know. But that after the Industrial Revolution, there is a historical crisis. So what Marx would argue is that the Industrial Revolution has created a crisis in our ability to mediate the social relations with labor because of the introduction of the industrial process of production, general science and technology, all these sorts of things. I mean, to put it in kind of smaller terms, this means that somebody working doesn't really have a full sense of what's going on, how production is operating, and doesn't seem to be subjectively a part of the process of reproduction society, right? And this has ramifications politically for democracy. And so, for Marx in 1848, his question is, why did it seem necessary at the step for these bourgeois Republicans, these bourgeois democratic Republicans, to ally themselves, first with the Unions and then with Napoleon, right? As in, why wasn't that the case? Why couldn't it work? Why didn't the revolution of the people, which is of course not just one thing, but many competing interests that through their antagonisms created general, why couldn't that be successful? And why was it unsuccessful in a very particular way? I mean, why was its lack of success the appearance of what appeared to be two classes of society, and not, okay, well, some people are just workers, they don't have to be proletarian, but rather two different tendencies within our social production, right? That were objectified by the political notion of utopia as either a blueprint or even a vague, sort of notion. Vague idea. I would point maybe to another definition given by a leftist thinker, maybe left, named Kowalski, which is that utopia is a tool. Because of course, any sort of utopian blueprint is the product of what is. It's the product of capitalism, which is attempting to understand what ought to be, what could and should be, but of course is non-identical with that. And as it is able to transform society, it changes also what the art is. It changes what that utopia would look like. And so the question is, how can you have a better or worse tool for transforming society, right? And I think, for example, something like theory is really important to that, because precisely the crisis of the democratic revolution that Marx is registering is that we cannot, through our individual activity mediated by labor and society, actually subjectively drive the history, our own history, right? And subjectively make our society, and actually we aren't living in freedom, we're living in unfreedom. And so the question is, how does one get from unfreedom to freedom? And it's not that the freedom grows within the society that we have. Actually, the Marxists argue against that. That actually every single reform that one might make doesn't take us closer to freedom, but actually makes the problem more acute. And this is what Marx saw through the democratic reforms of, for example, the national workshops, that actually just made the problem not tempered, didn't make people's lives necessarily better in a straightforward way, but it made the necessity of a different sort of revolution, of a different way of continuing the democratic revolution here. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that I thought it was interesting that the 19th century, that the vibrant civil society movement was brought up, because of course the 19th century was the century of the mass political parties for socialism, but also Platypus. And so I guess I was wondering, for example, John talked about needing to build institutions, what that might actually entail, because of course in a way the socialist parties were institutions, like for example, the Socialist Party in the United States would run night schools, they take care of their kids. I mean, there's lots of things that these parties would do. And it was about developing the revolution, right? Developing the necessity, not even necessarily the desirability, but making conscious the necessity of revolution that actually kind of happens to us behind the glass. And you might even argue that. That's the argument, so I guess I don't know what that is. So
So if anyone has a question for a particular person or that you'd like to pose to everybody on the panel, please raise your hand and I'll give you the mic.
This is a weird one. So this is, so this is something for everyone on the panel to discuss. Okay. So from its conception, Marx's theory was inherently anti-nationalist. However, it's undeniable that both radical leftism and Marxism and nationalism developed during the same era, the era of Romanticism. So they inherently do have a very complex relationship. And a very common argument that is often posed in historical analysis is that while nationalism as a concept was developed completely benevolently by Hegel's conception of the Volksgeist, it was very quickly turned into a tool used to hinder the development of class consciousness. So my question to you is, do you think that the strengthening of one of these concepts, being Marxism or radical leftism to incorporate anarchism, and nationalism, do you think that when one is strengthened, it inevitably causes the strengthening of the other concept? Or do you believe that it's more like a set of tipping scales, and that the proliferation of one concept will inevitably lead to the lessening or diminishing and possible eradication of the other one?
Okay. So clearly there is a vexed history between Marxism and nationalism. And of course, in the Communist Manifesto, the summoning of the workers of the world to unite, the workers having a fatherland, and so on and so forth. The market is an international market. The interests of the Clearly, I mean, one thing to say about this is one sees in that conflict between Marxism and nationalism the extent to which Marx is really, I mean, I think Marx has certain kind of, let's call them romantic tendencies. Indeed, I've got a piece coming out in German on precisely this question, but I see him as a figure of the Enlightenment. I mean, his conception of the human being and his conception of what a free society should be is a society of freely deliberating people. In that sense, I don't know what a Marxist future would look like without some conception of democracy insofar as self-determination clearly belongs to his idea of what freedom is. And in that sense, there's also a deep conflict with nationalism, because nationalism is an ascribed identity. It's an effective order that we come into. Benedict Anderson called it a fatality. He also talks about it in the community, but our belonging, just like we belong to certain families, we don't choose the nation we're born into. It's an ascribed identity, it's an ascribed affect. It's not part of our self-determination. So there are these really deep reasons for that conflict. I would say historically, in thinking most specifically about the German left and the party organized form of the German left, I think it's been a tragic fact of the history of the German left that at crucial moments they couldn't, and they were blind to the force of nationalism. They let the right own nationalism. And, that's a story really of the later 19th century. But at two crucial moments, they couldn't, in a sense, fight on the terrain of nationalism, and that was in the immediate lead up to the First World War. And what happens, the Social Democrats, in a sense, deny the fact that their sphere of action is the German nation state. And then in like one blinding moment of self-immolation, they vote to support the German National War effort. Okay? Then, of course, in the 1920s and into the 1930s, as the fight against fascism has escalated, which, especially German communism finds itself in knots following the week in Moscow, again, ceding the ground of nationalism fully to the right, underestimating its power, overestimating its capacity to fight from the vantage point of an international Marxist or international movement. Those would be some thoughts.
Nationalism, I think, on the one hand, it's an easy question. It's an attempt to construct barriers, to define others, and to exclude. And I don't see how it's consistent with any sort of utopian vision that we should be divided into these foreign camps. On the other hand, it has been developed for many years, but it can be challenged, and I think that's important. So, for example, in Chicago, in the 80s and 90s, the main fundraising activity that the German anarchists, the organization of their group, conducted every year was a Paris Commune celebration, where they brought together Germans and Czechs and other immigrant radicals to celebrate the commune. And that takes on this question of nationalism very directly. And I think, on one level, we can't ignore that. We certainly can't. But we also do need to be careful not to go down that road, because it is a road that leads to building walls of border and chain link fences and putting children in cages, and it's not a road that leads to any kind of well-known.
Yeah, fair. That's right. Well, I just wanted to add, just as an example of how, for instance, the 1920s periods could have gone differently. One of my good friends is a Swede historian who has written a comparative history and the concept of folk people in Germany and Sweden. It's a very similar language coming out of the 19th century, and yet in Sweden it's captured by the left, and it then lends itself to other kinds of composite nouns, like the folks' home. The folks' Now again, I also don't think of Sweden as a utopian endpoint, but if you think about the outcomes of two languages of politics in the 1930s, these are very different outcomes. No,
Alas. Yeah, I just want to add further complicating the story is that the impetus for transcending and breaking down borders at this point rests with capital. Right? And insofar as left governments, however one might feel about them, have been able to carve out any space, it's them within the context of the nation state we're talking about. Chile in the early 70s, Cuba, which I know may be more controversial to some people, but also Brazil and Argentina. Sorry, not Argentina, but Brazil and Venezuela. And Greece, right? I mean, Greece is like a quick, clear illustration. So it's complicated, right? And I think there's really no space for an historically transcendent principle stance about whose property national basis and ideology basically goes so was the point.
I would maybe want to try and also relate this question to kind of the broader topic of democracy in the left. Because if we look at, like, for example, the historical emergence of nationalism, it was, in the form of democratic demands against the internationalism of both the aristocracy and the church, right? So the French nation was useful because it undercut the church, which opened all over Europe, and the aristocracy, which of course ruled every nation or every kind of grouping, but was active as one body, right? And so the nation was a particular form through which bourgeois society was able to emerge, and which the democratic revolution was actually able to kind of push forward. And so the question is, why does that persist when it becomes clear that, socially and clearly economically, in terms of capitalism, we live in an international, right? We live in a global society. In one way, I think it's because the nation is how people have recourse to live, right? Capitalism is a political hell. You can't seem to get your demands even heard, perhaps by the nation, but seem actually to have that much of an effect on the life. But nevertheless, the nation is the means through which a political party or an individual can actually go to try and achieve these sort of aims, right? And so, for example, I think it's really kind of interesting that what came up when we talked about the nation, whether or not it's left or right, was the welfare state. Because in a lot of ways, I think the welfare state is a sort of, it could be conceived of as, for example, a national racket, right? So, the prime example is the Soviet Union, which I'm a massive welfare state. And the protection of the Soviet Union, of socialism and the revolution within the Soviet Union, was deemed theoretically necessary by the party, because they needed to, one, protect the interests of the working class within the Soviet Union, and two, Stalin collapsed that into the interest of the revolution. And so I wonder if it is so useful then to say that, for example, the use of nationalism to establish, for example, a welfare state in Sweden is actually getting us closer to socialism, right? It was the American welfare state closer to socialism than America was in the 1890s. Was the Soviet Union closer to socialism than Russia was under the Tsar? I think those are open questions.
I think socialism is a point to be measured in a continuum. It also, I guess, raises questions like where does idealism and realism sit? Like, where do these things sit together, right? Because I'm a historian and I know what happened in the 1930s and 40s, and I would prefer to live in Sweden. Even if by all measures of full human emancipation, Sweden then and now remains a capitalist country with a kind of social market economy. And so I don't know what it really means to set up a kind of normative place in a kind of figurative or imaginary space at which we can arrive. And short of that arrival, everything can be announced as actually contributing to the problem.
Well, maybe then I would what you talked about with the German party, which is that this is actually exactly what the German party thought, which is that the SED, yeah, the German Social Democratic Party, before World War I, right, that voted for war crimes in World War I, which is that, well, we actually established all of these different institutions that are making people's lives better. And so we can't wrap that by going into this, by allowing these other countries to perhaps destroy us in the war and are committed to some sort of international revolution. Right, so their exact argument for entering the war, and as you said, like basically return everything and blowing it, was that argument that, well, of course, it's better to live in Germany now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Why? Because we built all these institutions, we brought about these reforms, and not really idiots to try and blow it. And so I think, the question isn't, do we have some sort of, if we have some sort of normative definition of socialism, then one could say we are getting closer via this or that reform. The whole point is actually that we don't, but all we have is a problem that creates for us a task that we may or may not do, right? But either way, capital will be revolutionized. That's what we saw in World War I, right? Whether the German Social Democratic Party decided to make the revolution or not, still the masses of forces of production were going to be destroyed. People, millions and millions of people were going to die, and then of course later there would be dramatic downturn. People would starve, whole sections of industry would go out of business, and we would revolutionize capital anew, and that created the 20th century electrification. Electricity, nuclear energy, that happened anyway. Only it appeared as something that we would say, oh, these guys totally blew it, right? They would, and this revolution happened from the right.
I think we could think about reform, though, in a somewhat more creative way. That is to say, reform does not have to be that the state administers and that projects are run by enlightened technocrats and such forth. That if you could build, practically help these struggles, build these institutions, these related societies, such forth, I think that enables us on some level to sidestep the question of nationalism, because it becomes possible then to build direct alliances, such as United Electrical Workers, for example, doing with unions in Mexico, to deal with the problem of competition. And it also, again, builds our capacity, and it makes it more difficult to take things away if they're rooted in our communities, if we're running them ourselves, not that they won't be attacked, because they will be, just like the social welfare state in Sweden. I used to run over in Sweden in the 1990s, but Swedish to get talks about the horror of America and how they were trying to impose this on the Swedish workers. They don't bring me anymore because now they have it for
We have about 15 minutes left, and it would be good to take some more questions from the audience. So just raise your hand.
So we all talk about movements besides the state and force and change, but how would you respond to a lot of movements today that seem to do that, but are easily encapsulated with the current economic reality? You have movements for gay pride or cultural movements of that sort, which are very assimilated into just the workings of capital and don't do anything but just want to be equally involved in system capital. So you have Starbucks encouraging Black Lives Matter, things like that, things of that nature. Starbucks promoting radical leftist movements, but don't actually do anything else.
That's an interesting question. One way into it, I guess, is to wonder what counts as a social movement, right? For one thing, I wouldn't say, well, There are pressure groups, basically, or interest groups. There are some of what I would consider, frankly, Potemkin movements, right, that assume that that the way to assert political voice is through capturing the attention of the corporate media, right, and claiming in the name of the constituency that one claims without having any direct lines of accountability, right, to speak on it, and to speak on behalf of that constituency. Some of the, well, I'm hesitating because I'm trying to make a clear distinction in my head between the character of the broader sort of identity-based movements that rest on claims about shared tradition and perspective based on shared descriptive classification. Between that and frankly actual fights and conflicts, right, within left forces and competitions. It's certainly possible to identify movement, for instance, against mass incarceration, right, or for gay rights, or for abortion rights, right. It's not clear to me that there is anything organic that lives underneath the label Black Lives Matter, right. It seems to me that this is a loose, multitudinous maybe, I don't know, assemblage or concatenation of activists, right, who believe something very strongly, right, and to want to assert that set of beliefs that they have quite strongly. But beliefs that don't necessarily connect to public policy, for instance, and I think like the reparations debate is a good illustration of that, right? So, I mean, I think it's suggested, at least, right, that since 2016 at a minimum, that there does seem to be like a taking shape of more or less institutionalized alliance between identitarian interests in the Democratic coalition and the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, and now even, Forbes and Goldman Sachs, right? And I think, and from that perspective, I think there's a distinction between, or rather a distinction between material concerns, and by material concerns I mean the set of issues that have to do with stuff like jobs, employment, healthcare, education, and housing, right? That are shared very, very broadly within the society, and other issues that can certainly cross-cut, but they aren't necessarily the same, right? And frankly, I think the reality is that, insofar, like I hate to be so myopically focused, but the reality is that the number one objective, or the number one political objective needs to be trying to turn the tide that began actually, before Trump was elected. And the best way for us to do that, right, is to target issues that appeal most broadly, right, among the largest segment of the society who share concerns, right, about turning or about pursuit of more egalitarian, less less fees of the wealthy, public policy, what ways of organizing public life, right? And I also think, and this is the reason that I think the class versus identity debate is frankly bullshit. Because I think that the way that you build the solidarity that you need to make a change that has to happen is through starting out from what we all have in common, not from going around the room, first of all, to establish how we will live, right? And, but like at this point, what I saw like in November or December of 2018, Bernie Sanders' approval ratings were higher among Black Americans than they were among any other positions. But that's not what you get from talking heads on the MSNBC or professional race relations administrators in universities elsewhere. So, I mean, I don't know how much of an answer that is, but that's what I've got right now. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up, like thinking ahead, like let's say Sanders were to win.
Mm-hmm.
Do you imagine, like, I want to maybe a panel can think about how that would, what that would mean for like the Democratic Party with the nomination? Feel like it.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start off. I mean, yeah, I don't have many people I think of heroes. One is Benjamin Adolph, who's a pretty cool guy. But another is Sergeant Jacob Smirnoff, not Smirnoff, Adolph, but I shouldn't have found him. From Jackson, right? And often during the campaign, whether that young campaign workers were full of exuberance, would get really high or really low if something happened in Iowa or Wisconsin. And I'm just telling you, you gotta think like Sergeant Thompson, right? Your job is to hold this building, right? And as I see it now, like the objective, the question is asked is certainly a reasonable question. And it's complicated, because Sanders' hands will be tied around what he tried to do. But just as last time, I think the objective is to, and frankly, like, I wish that after 2016, he had taken a step back so that we could concentrate on building moving around issues like idea of law. And it's a testament to like how progressive forces have been habituated to think around the election cycle, right? That not much happened, right? Except precedent of 2018 elections and precedent 2020. But given that reality, and I've never been an electoralist, I'm not sure when I took over the left, but given that reality, then part of the objective is to keep him in contention and prominent in the race for primary or for the nomination for as long as he possibly can, and try through that means to simultaneously build support for Medicare for all, for agency that will last past 2020, doesn't matter what sort of place, right? Because no, I don't think we're going to elect ourselves into a better world, right? But given how weak progressive forces are and how unconnected they are in a broad society, I think it's important to look at the Sanders campaign as an opportunity to try to get some groups out there in the general population. Now, again, I don't know if that's the answer either, but it's the best I got.
From where I sit, I mean, obviously as an anarchist, I'm not going to be campaigning.
Right.
Although I did promise one of Burns to last year that if he got the nomination, I would register and vote for him.
Okay.
Good job, Michelle.
Good enough.
So I think
Well, wait, no, I don't think so, because, I think the element that's missing, right, is what something like Medicare for All does, right? I mean, it's not a panacea for problems with healthcare, but what it can do is, if people start talking about it and thinking about it, and believing that it's something we can win, then that can open up political imagination more broadly. Think about other things. You know, free public higher ed, like massive infrastructure, or non-commodified housing, right? But in making the transition, right, from the theoretically possible to the social movement that can actually change in terms of political debate, you got to start someplace, and you got to start with practical mobilization around practical stuff that people can understand as potentially having a significant impact on their lives for better.
So is there a role for a critical left, or is that something that must be laid in this process?
I think we have to try and think about this, certainly in terms of demands, campaigns that we put out there as these are real conditions of people's lives, but not just because I'm an anarchist, but also because of what you're saying, the day after the election. I think we have to do this not by funding people into the political electoral system. We have to do this by building independent movements and campaigns and targeting institutions, because at the end of the day, let's say the Bernie is elected. Let's say the Democrats don't have, but let's say they take the Senate. I don't believe, but
What did I take? But I don't think we're going to get elected. I think we're killing each other.
but regardless, let's say they success. The fact remains that the Catholics are going to make a hell of a fight to hold on to things the way they are. And the fact remains that Medicare for all would be better than our current healthcare system, which is an abomination. Would not actually make us free. That would not actually make society democratic. We need much more. And so we have to use issues that are on people's minds. We have to engage in struggles that speak to people's lives. Sometimes that might be a neighborhood where they're trying to do a redevelopment or kick out low-income housing so that they can gentrify. It might be tiny struggles, but we have to find struggles where people can be mobilized and fight these battles and build this sense of possibility in people. And we need to harness that sense of possibility to larger issues. And if we do that, even the restrictions of the road will give us reforms. And if we don't do that, it does not matter.
Right. Well, sorry.
I was just saying, we have a universal medical system, care system for decades, and contrary to a lot of the propaganda in America, survey after survey asking Canadians, what are you most proud of? It is the medical system. It's actually viewed as a big success. Yet it's clear. We only have to look to our northern neighbors to see that it's not the thin edge of a socialist wedge. I mean, it sits happily with the Canadian model of capitalism. And, I think that there are certain things, certain things that Canadian society has done better than America. We can still love guns better, So less violent society, you can go down a certain number of criteria. But it hasn't created the free society that we expect. So I would take the medical system, but I wouldn't assume too much beyond that.
Yeah, well, just to, this kind of speaks, this speaks a little bit to your question about precisely around the gentrification, right? These fights are all over the place, and it seems like every place I like is a big fight on gentrification. The problem is that gentrification is another conceptual formation, like so many others in contemporary American society, that obscures what's actually going on, right? Because gentrification carries an aura, I guess, displacement of Aboriginal populations, right? Well, first of all, there's no Aboriginal what's happening. What actually flies under the flag of gentrification is publicly supported private redevelopment for rent intensification. Now, I know, I mean, I'm sure that's the way German town, right? But it's more of a mouthful than gentrification. But what happens with the gentrification short is that in racializing, ultimately, what is fundamentally a political economic dynamic. It both obscures what was going on and undercuts the capacity to fight against it. Not least because members of the Aboriginal population, or people who can represent themselves as members of the Aboriginal population, easily convert the demand for justice into a demand for incorporation and the representation in the process. A deeper critical theory helps us, should help inform the political strategy, right? But it's true in many other areas as well. I mean, I guess the other thing is, given where we are at this point in the U.S., are there any baseball fans in the room? Well, I guess they need to be older ones, but my favorite baseball team is whoever's playing against the Boston Red Sox. So the 1986 World Series meant a lot to me. And one thing that the 1986 World Series shows was that once you put the ball in play, who knows what the fuck can happen, right? And at this point, we don't have the capacity to put the ball in play, right? So from that perspective, I think like the number one objective, right, main thing for us to take, right, and this really comes before any questions of what the ultimate process looks like, what the vision of socialism or the transformation is going to look like, is to figure out how to put the ball in play with at least one objective, futuristic objective of uniting the many to defeat the few is knowledge. That's kind of where we are. And whatever ways we can do that, like, at this point, nobody has a roadmap. So it's like tossing the friends together in the lowest game state.
I don't have a German word for intensification. but perhaps the most famous comment in German sports history, famous soccer coach in the 1950s, was asked to comment in an interview after a game. And big game, very critical game. Kind of top of the game, his comment was, the ball is round and the game's 60 minutes.
That's great. Yeah.
We're out of time, unfortunately, but if there's lots of remarks in the panel, so we can take a second. Otherwise, we'll end.
That's one quick question. It's completely unrelated to what we're talking about. But I was just wondering, because you said that the goal, the use of anarchists, the goal is like radical democracy. And I was under the impression that anarchists also work on democracy on some level. I got this impression from reading the Bekken critique of Lassalle. I was just kind of wondering about that. And also, if the firm's debating against the law, why not a party? I feel like we've been doing this for 50 years, but I don't know, that's just
Well, I'm not going to the party, but I've been trying often merge out the process, right? And organically I've struggled. But that's something I would say. I mean, and capital is not sleeping, right? Bourgeoisie is organized, and we have to be unorganized. And kind of randomness. And look, I mean, it's communist parties and communist parties have had their problems, and social democratic parties have had their problems. Not least of which is that way that they can manage capitalism's conversations more effectively than we would not always have. But like formations like the Workers' Party in Brazil that sort of grew out of decades of organizing and creating a movement in communities and neighborhoods that have a very broad base, but that come together under the commitment to transform the program. That's what I would consider an ideal for the development of the party. But unfortunately, yeah, I mean, but we're going away from it, right? And somebody who spent the better part of 15 years trying to build on it was anchored in the trade union with a lot of union affiliations. I can say it's had the time. Yeah. But I certainly can see that as an objective down the road or some other formation. It doesn't have to be a party necessarily, I don't know. But right now, like I said, it's like such a problem.
For us, and I don't want to say all that exactly alike, because that wouldn't be true. Or even desirable, perhaps. But as I read the Critique of Assault, it's not around democracy per se, it's around this particular notion of the political process, the electoral process, capturing the state and trying to sort of legislate, where he believed in organizing at the commune, at the workplace, but his notion there was always, I would say, fundamentally democratic. His language, not always, but when he talked about, for example, invisible dictatorship, that was people who had ideas, who argued for their ideas in the local communes, but talk among each other internationally to shape their ideas, which is in some sense a party, but not a party that's trying to establish administrative control. It's trying to win a contest of ideas. But, so, as I read the point, he is for democracy. But democracy of a different character, a bottom up, of a mobilization, as distinct from a democratic capture, and he does argue at one point that if you elect workers to parliament, they will cease to become workers and become bourgeois because they will become accustomed to being orders and administering. And I actually think in practice, I had a long argument with Platypus once about this, and he kept insisting that the Plymouth argument made no sense. But then I asked, okay, name me an example of a socialist elected government who remained a socialist, and he conceded that in practice the Plymouth was actually right. It's just, that they had turned out the way the Plymouth said it would turn out. It's just theoretically they see it should be possible. And maybe the whole people accountable, maybe build structures. But then that, we can't just use the state as it exists. We have to build democratic accountability and structures of control.
Okay, and that makes sense. Just say one thing about the electoral stuff, because I'm not sure it's clear before. I mean, there was a movie, pretty horrible movie in the late 70s by Paul Schrader called Hardcore. And it was like George C. Scott was an upper Midwestern Calvinist whose 12-year-old daughter had gone on a school trip to Disneyland and got swept up in the sex trade. And he goes out to try to find her, of course, and he meets up with the stereotypical young or sex worker with a heart of gold. And at one point, like, he's really uptight guy, and she offers him oral gratification, like calm him down, and he's freaked out by this. And she says to him, we really aren't all that different about sex, and he looks at her like she's crazy. And she says, well, yeah, I care so little about it that I'll do it with anybody, and you care so little about it that you won't do it at all. And I think that's something that's happened in electoral politics, right? So I actually wrote an essay about people yelling at me in 2016 saying essentially we shot up Bill Clinton. But one of the points I made in there is like, like the vote's not your chastity. I mean, this is something I mean, you both said, like, this is the weakest, most limited form of political participation. And you can use it promiscuously, because it's not really, it's not saying anything about who you are, or what the principles are, or anything about the existential. So I think voting is a purely pragmatic question, and people on the left have given it way more importance both positively and negatively than I think it warrants. But I promise I'm